The truth is usually much simpler than the complicated conspiracies and controversies that float around there. That doesn't make them any more encouraging, but at least it gives you some element of understanding so that you can make more empowered decisions in the future.
Amazing. So help us understand the truth that a lot of people believe, and then take us through what is the simpler truth that you see from your perspective?
The truth that seems to keep coming to the surface when it comes to everything from pharmaceuticals to big farming to geopolitics to the military-industrial complex, the truth that seems to be common to all of them is that there's some sort of overarching cabal of secret government people who are all working in conjunction against the American people. That is just flatly wrong. Frankly speaking, the government is barely competent enough to keep the wheels on the bus from falling off day to day. And I think that we've seen that multiple times, right? You saw that during the COVID crisis. You see it every 4 years during the presidential election season. You saw it during the Syrian war, the Libyan war. You saw it when Ukraine invaded Russia. You saw it in our withdrawal from Afghanistan. And it goes all the way back to the Korean War, the Vietnam War, civil rights movements. The federal government is not a well-oiled machine. It's a inherently inefficient, poorly communicative, and confused robot. Like, that left hand very rarely knows what the right hand is doing, let alone having any concept that there are feet or toes or nose included in the overall organism, right? So I want to start by making sure people understand, if you are holding on to a belief set that there's some kind of shadow government or secret government or deep state that's driving some sort of agenda to keep you unhealthy, that's not true. If it is true, it's the best kept secret that the federal government has ever had ever in its life.
Well, you mentioned that the federal government isn't a well-oiled machine, but a lot of people look at these companies, let's talk about big pharma with record profits, and they don't have the same constraints as the federal government. So their feeling is, okay, maybe our federal government can't get everything together and the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. But what about corporate espionage? What about corporate manipulation? What about the drive for corporate profit as a vehicle to keep things status quo and prevent people from thinking for themselves?
Now you're moving into the direction of the truth, right? Now you're actually being able to enunciate what we call objective reasoning when it comes to understanding what's really happening. So now that we can let go of the idea that there's some sort of organized nationwide effort against the American people, we can let that go, and that allows us to dig deeper into the corporate side of things. Because you're exactly right. Corporations are recognized through the lens of the federal government as individuals. That's important to understand. You have rights as an individual American citizen. Everybody who's an American citizen listening has individual rights. In the eyes of the government, a corporation also has the same individual rights as any single person. So McDonald's is essentially like an American citizen, and United Healthcare is like an American citizen. CVS, Walgreens, you name it, big pharma companies from Johnson & Johnson and beyond, they're single entities. So they're treated with all the same privacy laws, data control laws, tax laws that you and I have. So if a rich person can get out of paying taxes, guess what a rich company can also do, right? And if a rich person can say that their affair is kept private, guess what a company can do? It can keep all of their corruption private and claim it as a privacy issue, a personal privacy issue. Because in the eyes of the law, a company is the same thing as an individual. That makes it so that a company, it's in the company's best interest to be very efficient, where the federal government's best interest is to be inefficient. So now you start having an opportunity where companies can create anything from tobacco to alcohol to cannabis on into actual life-saving drugs like the treatment for AIDS, treatments for diabetes, treatments for polio. These are all things that companies can now treat as essentially privacy issues, as their own independent property. Even if it is open source or it can be made into a generic, the original code can still belong to them, just like your ideas belong to you and your copyright belongs to you and your IP belongs to you.
You've seen a lot, both as a former member of the CIA, but now in your training, often with companies and individuals and going on podcasts and you staying on top of world events, You're pretty in the know about a lot of things that are happening on the global and national landscape. So what are some of those common ways or any examples that you can think of that companies would be using to keep people from thinking from themselves and continue on the status quo, which maybe the byproduct is, you look at America, we have the highest obesity rates in the world. People are not really healthy. And there's a lot of core issues that are going on and that are finally being talked about on a national level with a little bit of the MAHA movement, which, by the way, now is turning into, just for everybody who's listening, is turning into a bipartisan movement. You have even people that are out there like Cory Booker on the Democratic side saying that, and Tim Ryan, we need to talk about health and we need to get to the root of why people are sick. We cannot keep this up anymore. So this isn't just a, hey, this is a Trump or Republican thing. Now, finally, everybody's kind of getting on board a little bit. So let me get back to my question. Are there ways that you've seen that corporations use through manipulation or lies keeping the status quo and preventing people from thinking from themselves?
This is an area where the questioning gets more complicated. And it's because where the American people are misdirected and where they are looking for answers and not getting answers is actually not in the corporate world or in the government world. It's where those two worlds meet. It's where governments and corporations come together. And that space is much more common than people realize. Let me give you an example. Corporations drive the tax base that governments need to run their government. That doesn't mean that the corporation gets taxed. It doesn't even necessarily mean that the CEO gets taxed. But if you have a corporation that has 10,000 employees, guess what all of those 10,000 employees do? They all pay taxes. So it's much more valuable to the federal government to be able to capture 12 or 18% tax from 10,000 employees than from one CEO. And the product that that company sells is also subject to a tax. And then there's state taxes on top of that. There's service fees. There's various ways that the government generates revenue based off of what the corporation does. So government, especially the American government, loves corporations. And for that reason, the government actually starts to change its legislation, change its policies, even put people in office because those people are friendly to business. And the bigger the business, the more friendly they become, which is why big pharma, big tobacco, big oil becomes so valuable to the federal government because no, they don't get to tax the CEO who's making $10 million a year, but they do get to tax every one of the employees that works for that CEO, which generates $250 million a year, right? So when you talk about understanding that corporations can be highly efficient and highly manipulative, then you also talk about the government being essentially dependent on corporations in order to drive the tax base that makes the government run. Now you start to see some of that space where information to the American public is lost because the government may say it wants a healthy population. But do you know what it wants even more than a healthy population? A population that generates enough tax revenue to run the country. And if keeping people unhealthy makes them buy more drugs, buy more medication, buy more personal trainers. They keep eating fast food. They keep driving cars. They keep, smoking their medication, whatever it might be. They keep self-medicating their way through depression rather than meditating their way through depression. Meditation doesn't come with a fee, right? So now you start to see that the government is looking for an economic engine, and it understands that big pharma, big farming, big medicine drives that economic base.
What's the relationship with either the government or these corporations and the media as the primary way of getting this message out there for whatever agenda it might be? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. It's funny. The media is one of those big misunderstood industries. And it's funny because people think they understand media when in fact it's kind of a mystery. First of all, journalism, true journalism, which we all know is on the decline, true journalism has always been based off of sources, just like intelligence. Intelligence is based off of sources. Journalism is based off of sources. And you have to vet those sources. You have to find information that corroborates your source. You have to do due diligence on your source, being a source of information. So when somebody says something to a journalist and a journalist turns that into a story, true journalism has put a lot of rigor and effort to make sure that what they're reporting is true. There are fewer true journalists out there, and there's more parroting of information. So what that means is now somebody can basically, a politician can write a tweet, and that tweet can become the subject of a news story. That is the antithesis of true journalism, even though everybody listening now and the vast majority of educated Americans we still believe that journalistic rigor exists. Where journalistic rigor does exist is actually only in a handful of major media outlets. The Wall Street Journals, the New York Times, the Washington Post. These are massive, massive conglomerates of media that do still have journalistic practice. So what ends up happening is when one of these 5 godfathers of media, when they report something, all of your other media outlets basically take their original story and then just repeat it with 1 or 2 new pieces of information that they may have pulled off of the internet or made up on their own. So what ends up happening is the same 5 sources of information turn into 50 reports throughout the course of the day, which is why when you see something at 8 o'clock in the morning and then you continue reading the news all day, you basically just see expansions on the same core stories. So to answer your question, Drew, when the government wants to say something, they say whatever messaging they want to say. And then when their message is out there, a media outlet picks it up. And then that media outlet amplifies whatever the original message was. Over the course of a day, you have multiple different media outlets repeating the same message. That's what actually creates what's known as a narrative. Because people pick up an overall message, they take a message, they turn it into a story, and that story is the narrative. So when people talk about the media narrative, they are using the correct term. It is a narrative. The government, however, does not create narratives. The government creates messages that they know will be turned into narratives over the course of the life cycle of media.
Freedom! So fresh on you.